Warhammer 40K has a huge problem, one that is only getting worse and worse at an exponential rate, and if isn't course corrected soon, could have dire consequences for the future of the franchise. Now, of course, I'm talking about the relentless oversaturation of Space Marines within the last decade, both in the novels released from the Black Library and the model line in 40K's tabletop game. Now, at first, this was all just kind of a joke to the 40K community. Of course, the poster children of Warhammer are gonna get the most attention, but with the end of the Horus Heresy earlier this year, the return of the Primarchs in modern 40K, and two huge milestone pieces of media that are going to introduce 40K to a massive new audience coming out soon, the Space Marine problem is about to get a whole lot worse. If I'm being totally honest with you, I feel pretty conflicted about this topic, and I wasn't sure if I actually wanted to make this video or not. But quietly over the last several years, I've had this huge fear that the franchise I'm so passionate about is slowly turning into the Space Marine universe instead of the 40K one. Eventually, I decided I needed to talk about it. And I want to make one thing really clear. I love the Space Marines. I'm a huge fan of their novels. I have both a Black Templar and a Death Guard army in the tabletop game, and I can't put into words how excited I am for Space Marine 2. That game may actually get me to start streaming on this channel. But as a Space Marine enthusiast, there can definitely be too much of a good thing. And Games Workshop's relentless push for more Space Marine everything has only been getting worse over time, and it's got me worried about 40K's future. But what exactly is this Space Marine problem, and what are its consequences? What do I think the future of 40K looks like based on Games Workshop's current trajectory, and what ramifications will their marketing strategy have on the future of the franchise? As excited as I am for Henry Cavill's eventual Amazon show and Space Marine 2, could their success further 40K's narrative stagnation? And ultimately, what can be done about all this? Well, in this video, we're going to be getting into all that and a whole lot more, as there's a lot to cover with the Space Marine problem. But before we get into all that, meeting your nutritional goals has never been easier with the help of today's sponsor, Factor, who delivers tasty and nutritious meals right to your doorstep. You can eat stress-free this summer, as Factor's meals are always fresh, never frozen, chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. You can choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including popular categories like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Vegan and Veggie. But that's not all. You can also discover more than 60 add-ons every week, like breakfast, on-the-go lunches, snacks, and beverages to help you stay fueled and feeling good all day long. What I like most about Factor is how simple it is. Now, being a YouTuber is not a hard job by any stretch of the imagination, but it does have a pretty crazy schedule and you put in a lot of long hours. When my schedule gets hectic, Factor is always flexible. I can always change up my order with plans that have anywhere from 4 to 18 meals per week, and if something ever comes up, I can pause or reschedule my deliveries at any time. Factor meals eliminate the hassle of prepping, cooking, and cleanup, so all I've got to do is heat and savor the good stuff. I can't recommend them enough if you're trying to eat better and take better care of yourself. Head on over to Factor75.com or click on the link below and use code WesHammer50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off next month's order. That's code WesHammer50 at Factor75.com to get 50% off your first box and 20% off next month's order. Big thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video. If it wasn't apparent already, this is going to be a totally different style of video than you're used to from me, as normally, I'm not a fan of negative videos unless I can find a way to make them funny. But this is something that's been bothering me for a long time, and I felt like I needed to talk about it. So if you don't want to hear me rant and bash on Games Workshop for the next 30 minutes, I totally understand. I'll catch you in the next one. But before we dive into the meat and potatoes of all this, we need to understand what the Space Marine problem actually is. At its core, it's Games Workshop's continued overprinting of a faction that is already popular, to the detriment of everything else in the series, leading to creative bankruptcy in the model line and a stagnating story that continues to feel smaller and smaller as our lens into the grimdark future becomes ever more narrow. It is a problem wherein a single faction is given more attention than any other, thus creating more demand for that faction, which in turn causes Games Workshop to give them even more attention, which in turn causes even more demand ad nauseum. This is a vicious cycle that is getting exponentially worse with no sign of stopping anytime soon, as Games Workshop's primary incentive as a business is to make money. And despite the damage that I believe this is doing to the long-term health of their brand, their profit margins continue to go up. A less cynical take on the Space Marine problem is that by overproducing Space Marines, a faction that historically sells very well, the Games Workshop in turn has more money to dedicate towards stories and models for factions that aren't as popular. On paper, this makes sense, but when you take a step back and look at just how profitable Games Workshop is, how long the Space Marine problem has been going on, and how little support all of the other factions are getting, you quickly realize that this isn't the case. The profits from the Space Marine sales are being funneled back into more Space Marines. This has become the norm. The ratio of Space Marine-centric stories and products compared to every other faction is grossly out of proportion. And it's only going to get worse from here, regardless of the long-term ramifications on the health of the brand. However, in fairness, it seems like going hard on Space Marines has actually worked out really well for Games Workshop. Their gross profit margin for the fiscal year of 2023 was 67.93%, according to the Wall Street Journal. Now that's astronomical. For reference, Google's parent company Alphabet had a gross profit margin in the same year of only 56.75%. Meaning that percentage-wise, a UK-based gaming company that produces models and stories in support of a franchise that, as beloved as it is still relatively niche, is more profitable than friggin' Google. Needless to say, it's a complicated situation. From me and many other Warhammer fans' perspective, the diverse array of factions and characters is what makes this franchise so interesting. Yet, year after year, we see the Space Marine model and novel line continue to balloon, which is unhealthy for the future of the franchise. However, from Games Workshop's perspective, money speaks louder than anything else. Their strategy has been incredibly successful, and thus they have no incentive to course correct. But is this sustainable? Can this possibly continue on indefinitely, or will a tipping point eventually be reached? What if it already has? There's a lot to cover with the Space Marine problem, and as much as I want to jump into the ramifications it has on the Future of 40K's lore, as I am a lore guy, I wouldn't be doing this topic justice if I didn't address the models and the tabletop game. So let's get that part out of the way first. It's actually kind of funny to think about it, but back in the day on Games Workshop's website, the Space Marines used to be included in the Imperium tab. However, their constant releases got so ridiculous, they eventually had to break them off into their own section. To this day, there are still factions that are playing the game with 20-year-old model kits, as well as factions that have so few units to choose from, they're restricted to hyper-specific builds that cater to uninteresting and repetitive playstyles. Yet, instead of addressing this, they continue to give us half a dozen or so new Space Marine units every single year, and seemingly thousands of variations of the same captain over and over. This one's got a jump pack. This one has a power sword. This one's in a slightly different pose, so it's definitely a new model. In Games Workshop's defense, they have put a lot of money into updating many of the Chaos and Xenos factions' outdated models. But the rate they've been doing this compared to their Space Marine releases is not comparable. It's as if in addition to all of the already planned Space Marine releases, every single time anyone that isn't a Space Marine gets a new model, the Space Marines also need to get their equal attention cake in the form of even more kits. A prime example of this being the Necron and Tyranid refreshes, which gave both of these factions a whole lot of much needed love. But most of their new kits came in the starter boxes for an edition, which means, of course, they came bundled with a whole bunch of new Space Marines as well. At the time of recording this video, if you were to go to Warhammer's website and click on the Space Marine tab, you would see they have 221 products currently available for purchase. Now, mind you, this is after they legendsed a whole bunch of older kits and relegated all of the Forge World models to only being usable in Horus Heresy, due to unfathomably stupid in-house politicking between their different departments. But that's a topic for a different video. For comparison, that's 90% of the entire Imperium line combined, which has 253 products for sale. That's 5.5 factions: the Sisters of Battle, the Custodes, the Mechanicus, the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Knights, and the Agents of the Imperium, which, if you're unfamiliar with, is the generic name they've given to all of their solo heroes like Assassins and Inquisitors. In my humble opinion, this isn't just crazily unbalanced, it's indicative of unhealthy and unsustainable business practices that, if left uncurved, may be the death of the 40K tabletop game. Now, admittedly, I'm being kinda hyperbolic, but I want to make one thing abundantly clear. Nobody likes this practice. Chaos, Xenos, and Imperial players don't like continuously getting ignored in favor of Games Workshop's favorite child. And the Space Marine players don't like having to pay what is referred to as the Space Marine tax, wherein they're constantly told to buy new expensive kits every month or so. And considering that Games Workshop's pricing model has made it next to impossible for new players to enter the tabletop space, they're basically just milking the established fan base, and it's starting to backfire. This is my own anecdotal experience, so take it with a grain of salt, but Warhammer 40K has pretty much died in my local community. Now, we're all still painting the models, we're reading the books, and a bunch of us are balls deep in a Necromunda campaign, but 40K 10th edition is pretty much dead. Now, every single person that you talk to in my community would give you a different reason for why they quit playing. But for me, and a lot of other people, the oversaturation of Space Marines had a lot to do with it. Since the launch of 10th edition, I would say that subjectively, about 70% of my local player base was playing Space Marines. And on paper, that makes sense. They're the most popular faction, and Games Workshop has made them easier to collect than any other due to their split boxes and constant combat patrols. Well, in addition, in 10th edition, at least at the beginning, their rules were just objectively better than most other factions. So not only did you have a lot of people who mained Space Marines because they loved them, but you also had a lot of people who normally played Chaos, Xenos, or other Imperial factions who got frustrated with their rules being garbage, and rather than quit, they put the army they loved away to play something that could actually win games. Barring a few exceptions like the Custodians or a very specific Necron list that abused broken, unkillable Catan, I felt like if you weren't running Space Marines, you were just there to get dunked on. Over time, more and more of the Xenos and Chaos players ended up quitting, until it was just Space Marines playing against themselves. And I don't know if you've ever played a Space Marine mirror match in 40K, but it's one of the most boring things you can possibly do. Not just because you're both literally doing the same thing, but also because the narrative sucks. You don't want to be controlling an army of Space Marines fighting off against another army of Space Marines for some contrived reason. You want to be sending your dude bros up against heretics and aliens. That's the fantasy of playing a Space Marine army. So needless to say, after all the Chaos, Imperial, and Xenos factions were gone, one by one, the Space Marine players all stopped showing up as well. But hey, I've been into Warhammer for 20 years. Sometimes the game is ass, and sometimes it's great. When it sucks, you take a break and do other things. When it's great, you dust off your models, microwave some Hot Pockets, crack open a can of Diet Mountain Dew, and get down to business. So if the Space Marine problem was relegated to just the models in the tabletop game, it's a problem I could probably ignore. But that isn't the case. It's bled over into the Black Library as well. And as a person that takes the lore way too seriously, I'm pretty worried about this. I've been very vocal in the past about my respect for Games Workshop's dedication to world building. If you were unaware, the Black Library makes up less than 1% of GW's overall profits, yet they continue to release more and more novels, as they seem to understand that each and every one of them is a commitment to their universe. However, the Space Marine problem is alive and well within the novel range. For every book like The Infinite and the Divine, we get a dozen Space Marine novels, all with copy and pasted themes, characters, and plots. Not only are we getting less diversity in 40K storytelling, but interesting niche lines like the Crime series and Warhammer Horror receive less and less attention until they are quietly abandoned. In the lore of 40K, there are hundreds if not thousands of distinct and interesting factions, but it would be ridiculous to assume one-off groups from a single novel would get equal representation in the novel line. So for this analogy, we're just going to look at ones that are playable in the tabletop game, as those are the factions that the majority of the fanbase actually cares about. For the most part, there are around 20 playable factions, so in this context, we would expect books centered on the Space Marines to make up about 5% of the last 100 novels released about Warhammer 40K. But that number is beyond wishful thinking, because the actual number is about 45%. And that's not including the Horus Heresy, because if we did, that number would be way more ridiculous, as the Horus Heresy is like 90% Space Marines. But speaking of which, I find it ridiculous that we'll get over 80 books set during the Heresy, which, mind you, is only a period of about 9 years, detailing every time a Space Marine stopped to scratch his ass. But a book set during the War in Heaven? A period that potentially spanned millions of years and is arguably one of the most important events in the entire timeline? What about one that gives us some insight into the collapse of the Eldar Empire and the birth of Slaanesh? Or maybe even a book set during the Dark Age of technology? Nope, can't be done. You see, unfortunately, there were no Space Marines during any of those time periods, so there would be no point in writing a book during them. It can't be done. You ask way too much. Okay, well then at bare minimum, Games Workshop, can we get a freaking Votan novel, as we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of their release? Nope, can't be done. Unfortunately, that's not a Space Marine faction. So we need to release about 500 more Space Marine books and then we'll talk. Hell, even in the debut novel for important universe-defining characters like Belisarius Caul's great work, we have to spend half of the book dedicated to the Emperor's Scythe chapter of Primaris Marines. Coming from somebody who loves Space Marines, it's kind of ridiculous. So now we come to the real reason I'm making this video, the meat and potatoes of what's got me so worried about the future of 40K. Right now in 2024, the Warhammer franchise is standing at the precipice of a whole new era of lore. 3 massive things are occurring that are going to change this franchise in a huge way. The end of the Horus Heresy, the Space Marine 2 video game, and Henry Cavill's 40K Amazon show. Although we almost certainly will get a couple of epilogue novels tying up all the loose ends of the heresy, with the release of The End in the Death Volume 3 earlier this year, the heresy is done. It's over, which isn't great for Games Workshop as it has been ludicrously popular. But for modern 40K fans, this might end up being a really good thing, because all of their best authors had to dedicate a pretty large chunk of their writing time to the heresy. Now they're going to be free to go back to modern 40K. It's very possible we're going to enter into a new renaissance of modern 40K fiction, where all of the factions get explored and fleshed out in much more detail. Well, we also might explore 40K's time periods that are still kind of a mystery, like the Age of Apostasy, the Age of Strife, the Astropath Wars, or hell, maybe even the Year of Ghosts. What the hell was that all about? That's the good ending. The bad one, however, is that they triple down on Space Marine stories. They bring back all of the Primarchs one after another, and they turn 40K into the Horus Heresy 2.0, which, in my opinion, would be an absolute travesty and would destroy what makes 40K so special. The story of the Primarchs has been told, and if it was up to me, they would be left in the past. I love the Primarchs, don't get it twisted, and my inner fanboy, I'm not gonna lie to you, is excited to see them return, but I'm also aware of just how enormously influential figures like that are. Their narrative impact has the density of a dying star and warps the story around them. Characters like Marneus, Ahriman, and Typhus will always be around in some respect, but their role within the story isn't nearly as important as it is now that Guilliman, Magnus, and Mortarion are back. You can't put the Primarch genie back in the bottle. Once they return to the setting, that's it. They're here for good. This isn't like an anime arc that goes off in a unique storytelling direction until it's run its course, and then they go back to the main narrative. Once they've received a model in the tabletop game, it's done. It took them 30 years to let an important named character like Commissar Yarrick die, and there's already rumors that they're about to bring him back. And considering that we've already seen 5 Primarchs return, with Fulgrim rumored to be coming out by the end of this year, all signs are pointing to this being the path that Games Workshop ends up taking. But this isn't a video about the return of the Primarchs. This is about the Space Marines' domination of the Black Library. So let's focus on the impact of their market share continuing to expand year after year. Now, as I mentioned before, the end of the heresy is not the only big shakeup that's happening, as we're about to get the Space Marine 2 game from Saber Interactive later this year, and at some point, Henry Cavill's Amazon TV show is going to come out. Or maybe it won't, depending on whatever rumor of the week the reactionary channels are pushing this time. But even if it doesn't, there will eventually be a Warhammer cinematic universe. The franchise is too big, and there's too much money on the table for it to be ignored by Hollywood forever. Space Marine 2, and whatever show happens to come out, is going to be absolutely massive, and will end up being a lot of people's first introduction to Warhammer. In both instances, we're going to see an enormous influx of new people get into 40K for the first time, which on one hand is amazing. I love that. I love seeing people get interested in the things that I'm passionate about. But the problem here is with Space Marine 2, and there's a 90% probability that the Henry Cavill show will also be Space Marine centric. The lens these newcomers are coming into this franchise with is one told from the Space Marines perspective. It is not the 40K universe to them, it's the Space Marine universe. And I'm just making up numbers here, but let's say that the size of our community quite literally doubles because of these two pivotal pieces of media, and all the people who join are Space Marine fans first and foremost. If you think the number of Space Marine models and novels we're getting now is ridiculous and unsustainable, you have no idea what is coming. It is going to get so much worse. Ironically, as Warhammer continues to grow larger and larger and go more and more mainstream, the scope of its storytelling will get smaller and smaller. And please don't misunderstand me, I welcome all of these newcomers, and I'm excited to see all of these people getting into this franchise for the first time. The thing I love more than anything else in this entire universe, other than my wife and my mama, is when I'm able to introduce somebody to something that I'm passionate about and they end up falling in love with it. There's no better feeling in the entire world to me. So seeing people discover 40K like this for the first time, no matter how they got into it, is something I'm super looking forward to. This is not a gatekeeping thing. The only requirement to being part of the 40K community is to like Warhammer. That's it, and you can enjoy it in any way that you want. It doesn't matter how you got into it or what you find endearing about the franchise. You're one of us. What has me worried, however, is that this influx of new Space Marine fans will only incentivize Games Workshop to make the Space Marine problem even worse. But Wes, I hear you asking, why do you care so much? Don't you love the Space Marines? Don't you have a whole Black Templar army in the tabletop game? Who cares if the majority of the books we're getting are from their perspective? What's the big deal? In fairness, there is some truth to this. I have really enjoyed the vast majority of the Space Marine-centric stories that I've read, but I can also acknowledge as a Space Marine fan that as a narrative lens into this universe, they're severely limited in the types of stories that they're suited to tell. The human perspective will always be the main one, don't get it twisted. It makes sense. It's easier for us to identify with a guardsman or a space marine than a 20,000-year-old Eldar Farseer or a 60-million-year-old data ghost trapped inside a robot skeleton. Although I personally love books written from the alien's perspective, I recognize that that's not the norm when looking at a mass audience. And despite them being the most common human perspective in the novels, Space Marines are not human. They are transhuman, and certain fundamental traits that make human characters complex and interesting are anathema to the Space Marines. They don't experience emotion like we do. In my opinion, the horror elements of Warhammer are an intrinsic part of this franchise's identity. But how do you convey horror to an audience through the lens of a nearly invincible super soldier that cannot experience fear on a biological level? Let's say they encounter an unknown Xenos life form, a good old-fashioned eldritch horror beyond human comprehension that has existed since time began. This creature has the potential to be equally as horrifying as it is insightful. It can disturb the audience on a primal level and provide the characters of the story with dark answers to questions their fallible human minds were not capable of contemplating on their own. What an unbelievably interesting and creepy situation that would be. But with 90% of Space Marine main characters, are they going to have a deep, insightful conversation? Is the Space Marine going to be able to be an appropriate vessel to convey its true horror to us as the audience? Absolutely not. Suffer not the alien to live. In fairness, this isn't the Space Marines' fault. Their lore is pretty clear. Barring a small handful of individuals, they are for the most part all child soldiers that never got a chance to fully develop before being kidnapped and hypno-indoctrinated into their chapter. They are not people from the lore's perspective. They are tools, weapons to be used by the Imperium, and that is the entire point. Which doesn't make for a deep and complex character. As I said before, I've read a lot of Space Marine novels, and I enjoy Space Marine characters, but after a certain point, they all kind of start to blur together. There are very few things that truly allow them to stand apart from their brothers, and their personalities are all derivative of the honorable soldier archetype. The things that do make them stand out, the things that make them memorable, are not their personalities, it's the events they were involved in, or as sadly as too often the case, of the particular MacGuffin they fought over. The vast majority of the differences between Space Marine characters are normally the influence of their unique chapter, rather than the fundamental aspects of who they are as a man. The things they care about, their personalities, their wants, ambitions, their moral compasses, are all minor variations of the same thing over and over. And because of this, it takes an exceptionally skilled author that truly understands this universe to come up with new novels that stand apart from the rest and tell a different kind of Space Marine story. which, in my personal opinion, the majority of the Black Library authors are not capable of, with the exception of people like Dan Abnett or Peter Faveri. With Space Marine 2 and Henry Cavill's show on the horizon, there's going to be a ton of new Space Marine fans for Games Workshop to sell Space Marine models and novels to. And with the Horus Heresy now coming to an end, all of those authors are now free to write even more modern Space Marine stories. I truly hope that we're going to get more diversity in the novels in the future, but just based on these patterns, I'm worried that the Space Marine problem is about to become worse than it has ever been. If you made it all the way to this point in the video, I'm sorry for being such a buzzkill. I try to limit how much negativity is in my videos, as honestly I think there's way too much of that on YouTube as there is, but this is something that's been bothering me for a while and I just had to talk about it. I love this franchise. I love every aspect about it, and I don't want to see it become the Space Marine show. I don't want to see all of the Xenos, Chaos, and other Imperial factions get relegated to simply the villain of the week for the Space Marines to kill, or an auxiliary force that's only there to pay lip service to a once interesting and varied grimdark universe. The constant overexposure of a single faction, the over-reliance on copy-and-paste characters, and the telling of stories with the exact same themes over and over causes creativity to stagnate, and the franchise to feel more and more one-dimensional. Fresh perspectives and untold stories are what keeps a franchise like this vibrant and exciting. It's what causes new people to get interested in it for the first time and keeps longtime fans engaged. Games Workshop's current strategy is disheartening to say the least, and risks burning out its established fan base. People crave variety in a franchise as expansive as this one. GW should be tapping into its full potential, not just doubling down on what's already popular. But what do you think of all this? Are you as worried about the narrative future of 40K as I am, or am I blowing this all out of proportion? Do you agree with me that Space Marines are getting pushed too hard and all of the other factions deserve representation in the story and model line as well? Do you disagree and think that Space Marines are the core identity of what 40K is all about, and them objectively being the main characters is totally fine? If you had full control, what direction would you like to see 40K's narrative go in? What factions or characters would you have them write books about? And what time periods or major campaigns or events would you like to see them explore in more depth? Like I said, this is a weird video for me. I actually rewrote this script like 7 times as I was super conflicted on my feelings on this whole thing, and I'm genuinely really looking forward to reading y'all's thoughts on this one in the comments section. Also, as always, I'm never married to my opinions. Any videos that are overly opinionated like this one are a snapshot of my thoughts and beliefs at that moment in time, and they're always subject to change when I'm presented with new information. So honestly, I'd love to be proven wrong on this one. As always, big thanks to everybody who supports the work that I do, and I'll catch y'all on the next one.